There's no recording. We're singing live, is it? Yeah. Just Kanda.
We can also play that.
Do you want to? What's the normal? What do we
We put a recording. We do the recording.
Okay, so let's start recording.
Can I play that?
Yes.
One of them is not lit, or three of them are out. So. Is there a fan or something?
Oh, yeah, this.
Is that? Maybe we turn it off briefly.
Oh, we've started the recording. Please no walking in front of the camera.
This is the way that we use them. I think so. This also looks.
It's not
Let's
catchy.
check later.
It's not tree.
I just use it just up. Yeah. I was just using it.
Oh, there we go. Something stays.
That's on.
Turn on the fan again. I'm very hot. Okay, so now we start, huh? হ্যাঁ, বড্ড গরম লাগছে। Yeah, it's fine. So, is it fine on the camera?
Yeah, I think
Just check and let me know. And mic-wise,
I checked the audio.
okay, cool.
Vedanta family, welcome. It's a special day today, and we have a special event, and we are especially blessed and fortunate that Swami Medhanandaji Maharaj is here for the first time. That's something which we are quite interested and also excited to know that. And most of you, including me, we do not know complete background of Maharaj. I went through his CV. I was shot into a different planet altogether. It's so outstanding. And, Maharaj is a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. PhD in philosophy, that's something which is very, very confusing, complex to us, but he's going to explain that in a simple way. And as you may know, that he has given many lectures on the Vedanta philosophy, and some of them are received with huge attention. And he has about 53 publications and conference proceedings and article submission, and has 34 research papers. And remember, he has 4 outstanding books. I don't have the details to go into it. They are well received. And another important thing I notice is he has 5 keynote addresses. Many of you who attended the conference, you know what keynote address means. That is the trendsetter for the entire conference. Usually conference organizers do not invite anybody. They invite the most expert, the best expert in the field internationally. They invite for such the keynote address. Maharaj has got 5 keynote addresses already. Maharaj is too young. You can see he received his sannyas in 2020, just 3 years ago, so fresh. And many more to come, and The only thing, the last thing I noticed in CV is he has got highest honors in English. That scared me. I may be butchering English in his very presence. So I will stop and then hand over to Maharaj.
Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya Sarvadharmasvarupine Avatara Varishtaya Ramakrishnaya Te Namaha. Good evening, everyone. Thank you to Anandanji for the very overly generous introduction. The mic doesn't seem to be working, but is it fine? I mean, it's not working. Oh, it wasn't on. So now it's on, and how do you? Okay. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for making me feel so at home here. It's my first visit to Austin in my entire life. I'd come to Texas, I think, long back. I grew up in Boston. I was a high school debater. So debate took me to different states. So I remember coming to Texas, but I don't remember where in Texas. It was some private school. There was a debate tournament. But I'm almost certain I never came to Austin. Audio's okay? Yeah? Okay. Okay, yeah, I'm putting it on the side. So maybe, yeah, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So it's a pleasure to be here. I had a wonderful time with Rajendra Ji this morning. For most of the day, he took me to Mount Bonnell. Which really, Sri Ramakrishna used to say, when you see the beauty of nature, it reminds you of God. And I really felt that. So it's very nice. So the topic today, the problem of desire in spiritual life. You'll find if you study the world's religious scriptures that every scripture almost emphasizes the need to renounce desires for things of the world. This is almost universal. You're going to find Jesus saying you can choose God or mammon, but not both. What does mammon mean? Anyone know what mammon means? M-A-M-M-O-N. It means worldliness, the world. You can choose God or you can choose the world, but you can't choose both. Take your pick. Choose wisely. Katha Upanishad says exactly the same thing. Shreyascha preyascha manushyametastau samparita vivinakti dhiraha. Two paths confront every single human being in this world. The path of Shreya on the one hand, which Swami Medhanandaji, I think, gives a very nice translation. The path of Shreya is the path of perfection, the path of spiritual perfection. And the other path is Preya. It's a much more well-trodden road, much wider, seems more appealing. Preya means enjoyment, the path of enjoyment, worldly enjoyment. And you have to take your pick. You're at a crossroads. You're at a fork. And then you have to choose. God or mammon, Jesus says. Katha Upanishad, the great rishi of the Katha Upanishad, says you can choose the path of Shreya or the path of Preya. Same idea. Buddhism. Now Buddhism is all the rage, and there are all these mindfulness retreats and meditation workshops and all these things. So a lot of people are familiar with Buddhism. At least you should know about the Four Noble Truths. And that could be a separate lecture, so I'm not going to go into the details. But what is the first noble truth? Most of you probably know this. All life is suffering. Everything is dukkham. Sarvam dukkham. Now, exactly how to translate dukkham is an interesting question. And some people say everything is unsatisfactory, or everything ultimately ends in frustration. These are kind of different translations, but suffering is a kind of standard translation of the first noble truth. Second noble truth is, what is the cause of all suffering, of all dukkham? The answer is desire. Tanha in Pali, which comes from the Sanskrit Trishna. If there are Bengalis in the audience, we say Tishta Pacha. It means I'm feeling thirsty. That comes from this Trishna in Sanskrit. Thirst, but thirst for what? Not for water, but for sense enjoyments, for the things of the world. That is the root of all of our suffering, according to Buddhism. So you find that there's a kind of consensus across the world's religious traditions that in order to make real progress in spiritual life, you have to renounce worldly desires and worldly attachments. We all know this, but it sort of feels like religion becomes a kind of list of do's and don'ts, and it's like it doesn't sound fun. It doesn't sound like something that you want to jump into and get excited about, you know? Something your grandfather will tell you, don't do this, don't do that. But so that's why I want to go more deeply into why do the great religions tell us to renounce worldly desires? What's the logic behind it? It's not just because a scripture tells us to do it, that's why we should do it. What's the underlying logic behind renouncing desire? Why is it so necessary in spiritual life? That's what I want to explore today. I'll just let me mention a couple other texts here on the Hindu side of things with regard to renunciation of desire. Holy Mother, many of you are familiar with her teachings. She used to say, if you pray to God for anything, what should you pray for? Does anyone know? What did Holy Mother tell us to pray for? When you pray to God, what should you ask for? No, she didn't say liberation. That's a good guess. These are good guesses, but it's not. There's an exact word in Bengali. Nirvasana. Nirvasana in Sanskrit. The Bengali is nirvasana. Pray to God for desirelessness. The beauty of this prayer is if you get desirelessness, you get everything else. You get vairagya, you get bhakti, you get everything else. You get liberation. Because what keeps us bound to this world is our worldly desires. So she's very smart. So she said, if you pray for this one thing, you get everything. All the great spiritual gifts come automatically if you become desireless. Another thing she said, which is very startling and which is troubling to a lot of devotees, especially in our tradition, a lot of our monks, devotees, they like to eat. But she says, if you have a desire for even one sandesh, which is one of the classic Bengali sweets, you will not attain liberation. Just see what she's saying. So we'll get to that a little bit later about the sandesh problem. Remind me if I forget, because it's an important problem, the sandesh problem. So we'll get to it. And Sri Ramakrishna, one of his favorite scriptures, of course, was the Bhagavad Gita. And he would say, what is the essence of the Bhagavad Gita? He says, you get the essence of the Bhagavad Gita by just repeating the word over and over again. Gita, 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 Gita. What happens? Tagi, Tyagi. Renounce, renounce, renounce. The keynote, he was talking about keynotes, not my keynotes, but this is the keynote of the Bhagavad Gita. The keynote of the Bhagavad Gita. Renounce desires, renounce worldliness, and you will realize God. This is also the keynote of the gospel, the Kathamrita, the gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Again and again, he's emphasizing the need to renounce. In the West, we're in the West. We have all sorts of Western friends and colleagues, and when you tell many Westerners this, they say, renounce. Why should we renounce desire? Desire is what makes life worth living. Desire is what makes life beautiful. Without desire, we're like stones and trees. I've heard this many times. They say, I don't want to live a life without desire. It's desire that gives me motivation to live. That gets me up in the morning. It's because I desire to do something that I get up and do this and do that. This is a very common objection. And you'll find that even though now spirituality is kind of a craze, meditation apps, spirituality apps are proliferating, mindfulness apps, and now with YouTube and post-pandemic times, everything is on YouTube, and all these big spiritual gurus in different traditions are teaching us how to meditate and this and that. The one thing that most people don't emphasize is renunciation. All sorts of things are emphasized about mindfulness and breath mindfulness, and then yoga, yogasanas, and all these things. But nobody wants to talk about renunciation because they'll lose a lot of people the moment they bring up renunciation. And these people are good marketers, if nothing else. So now the question is, why is getting rid of desire so important in spiritual life? Let me begin with a story that's found in the Bhagavata Purana, one of our great Vaishnava scriptures. There's a story about a king named Yayati. And you know how classically Indian kings are full of worldly desires. They're not satisfied with one wife, so they'll have 10 wives and 6 courtesans and then so many vehicles and this and that. So he has everything, and yet he's still not satisfied. So what does he do? He lines up his sons. And he says, I want to exchange my body with one of your young, supple bodies so I can enjoy more to my heart's content. And his the youngest son agrees. He says, okay, father, let's exchange bodies. Magically, they exchange bodies. He's now in his son's body, and he enjoys for a long time. And it's typical of Hindu scriptures to give very large figures. So I think it might be in the thousands of years range. I mean, this is not a normal lifespan of just bhoga, enjoyment, sense enjoyments, this and that, to his heart's content. But not to his heart's content. That's the whole problem. He finds at the end of all of this that he doesn't find the satisfaction and happiness that he's looking for. Everybody thinks that if I just get this X or Y or Z, then I'll be happy. And yet nobody succeeds. Nobody in the history of this world has succeeded. And so after he does many, many thousands of years of engages in these sense enjoyments using his son's body, he finally comes to this realization. And he says, this is a famous statement that's often quoted in spiritual discourses, Na jatu kamaha kamanam upabhogena shamyati havisha krishnavatmeva bhuya eva vivartate. Kama, desire, is never satisfied, never quenched, never fulfilled through enjoyment. Rather, and it uses a beautiful metaphor, he uses the metaphor of a fire. Imagine there's a fire, and you're trying to put out the fire. So one person has a brilliant idea, let me throw ghee into the fire, clarified butter. It's like oil. In the West, you'd say oil. What happens if you throw oil into a fire? It increases. Exactly like that. Even though people think that if I just fulfill desire X or Y, then I'll be satisfied, I'll be happy. The opposite happens. Desires multiply, they get intensified, they get strengthened rather than extinguished. This is the realization he came to after many, 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 many years of sense enjoyments. Sri Ramakrishna used to say in Bangla, Bhog anto na hole tag ashana. Until you have passed through the end of enjoyments, you will not feel that true spirit of renunciation. Now, that doesn't give us a license for enjoyment. The thing is, this is a journey of many lifetimes. In Hinduism, we don't have one life, we have many lifetimes. We believe in karma, we believe in rebirth. In fact, I'm writing a book right now called Karma and Rebirth in Hinduism, so stay tuned. So it's a journey of many lives. So you have to take the kind of long view as a spiritual aspirant. And for instance, there's a senior monk who would tell other monks, this is a story handed down to us. He would tell young brahmacharis who are in training to be sannyasis, he said, you're all monks in this life because you were married in a previous life. And that's true of all of us, that we've all gone through enjoyments, but not necessarily all in this life. So Sri Ramakrishna is not saying, and Yati is not saying that, you pass through all sense enjoyments in this life and then you can renounce. It depends on where you are. We're all running the same marathon. Some people are at the beginning of the marathon, other people at mile 5, other people at mile 12, other people at mile 25. And you can't tell outwardly. The guru tells you where you are and what you need to do, what your next steps are, right? So what did Yayati realize? What did King Yayati realize after so many years of engaging in sense enjoyments, ultimately ending in frustration? Why? Why does striving to fulfill our desires always result in frustration and disappointment and lack of happiness and contentment in the end? That's the fundamental question which I want to discuss today. And also I want to open it up for questions afterward to hear from you and your own thoughts about this. The basic idea is this, it seems to me. Having a desire means that you're missing something. You're feeling a lack. You desire something because you're not content with what you already are, what you already have. I think this is uncontroversial. I don't think that this is a controversial statement, right? You desire something because you don't have it. If you had it, you wouldn't desire it, right? So all desire stems from a lack, from some kind of emptiness within. And the problem is, we feel that inner emptiness, and then we think that, okay, as long as once we get this sense object or this thing that we've been wanting for so many years, that inner emptiness will be filled. It'll either go away or I'll be satisfied, I'll be happy. And it never happens. And the reason is because desire is never fulfilled through enjoyment. This is what Yayati realized. Even though because of Maya, because of delusion, we all seem to think, the vast majority of human beings on this earth, we are under the delusion that the fulfillment of desire will lead to ultimate happiness. And nobody has ever succeeded in this endeavor. And the opposite happens because the moment we fulfill a desire, and the stronger the desire, the stronger that this logic takes place. The desire itself gets intensified. There's a very, very brief, fleeting moment of satisfaction when that desire is quenched. And then right after that, the desire gets intensified or it redoubles or it gets multiplied. So you have one rasgulla, you're satisfied for about 2 seconds, and then immediately you say, if I have just one more, just to really, that's really going to hit the spot. I have one more. Okay, how about one more, just one more, and then we'll call it a day. With each, so there's this law of diminishing returns in economics, right? Which means that first rasgulla is going to taste fantastic. And you think that every subsequent rasgulla that you eat is going to be equally fantastic, but it's not the case. But you can't help yourself. So you have to have the second one. Second one is not quite as good as the first one. Then you think, well, the third one will be better than the second one. But it's even worse. And it just gets worse and worse. The law of diminishing returns. So this is the law of desire. These are facts of life. We can't change the logic of desire. We have to accept the facts of life. And for many people, it comes very late in life. It might not come in this life at all. It might come at the very end of a person's life on their deathbed. You find also that there are these cases of multi-billionaires who seem like the most miserable people on earth. I don't need to name names. You can probably think of your own person. And people who seem to have everything in terms of worldly enjoyments and celebrities, they end up dying of drug overdoses. Think about it. Drug addiction, it's exactly the same logic of desire. Because when they have whatever that drug is, whether it's heroin or cocaine, they have it the first time. And they have such a state of euphoria. They haven't experienced anything like that in their entire life. And they say, I must have that again. I must have it again. And that moment of euphoria lasts maybe a couple seconds, or I mean, a little longer sometimes, especially the first time you. And then they try to reproduce that experience, that feeling, and they never succeed. And then they end up in this vicious cycle of addiction, which often ends tragically in death. And if not death, then hospitalization. They become mental basket cases. These are great tragedies. And when we see this, there's a huge opioid epidemic now throughout the country here. But throughout the world, there are serious drug addictions. It all stems from the same logic, this inner logic of desire. Everybody thinks that if I just fulfill this desire, I'll be happy, I'll be satisfied, I'll be content. But nobody ever succeeds. Because it's the very nature of desire never to be satisfied. Bhagavad Gita, in chapter 3, Arjuna asks a very poignant question. After hearing a lot of spiritual discourses from Bhagavan Krishna, Arjuna, in despair, he says, that's all well and good, but atakkena prayuktoyam papam charati purushaha anichchanapi vashneya baladev niyojitaha. But Arjuna says, I understand what you're saying. I understand that it's good and better to renounce desire. I know what's right, what I ought to do. And yet I feel somehow compelled to do what's wrong. As if by force, he says. As if by force. What is it that impels me to do what's really not good for me spiritually and ethically? And then Bhagavan Krishna gives the following answer. Kama esha krodha esha rajo guna samudbhavaha mahashano mahapapma vidhyenam ehvairinam. What impels you are two things. Kama, which means worldly desires, or more specifically lust. That's why Sri Ramakrishna would say again and again, Kama kanchana tyag, you should renounce lust, renounce the objects of lust. And krodha, anger, frustration. When you get possessed either by lust or by anger, what happens? It's like you're possessed by like a demon. You become somebody completely different from who you normally are. This This is true of everybody. And again, you see there are famous cases of people, extremely prominent television personalities and people or brilliant intellectuals. What is their downfall? Lust. They get carried away. They know that they ought not to, but they get carried away by it. Why? Because kama, according to Bhagavan Krishna, is mahashano mahapapma, all devouring, mahashano. It's never satisfied. It's like, imagine you have this like nightmare pet, like a guinea pig or something. The kids have these guinea pigs, so I don't know, they used to when I was growing up. I don't know what they have now. In elementary school, we would have this. You feed your guinea pig because the guinea pig is squawking for food. You give the food. It squawks even more, and you give it more food. It's getting fatter and fatter all the time until it bursts out of its cage and it keeps shouting at the top of its lungs, and you can never satisfy it. Desire is like that. The more you feed it, the more hungry that desire becomes, and it's never quenched. It's never satisfied. So just it's like, and another thing, when I was growing up, now you know my age, because based on these cultural references, there's a thing called Tamagotchi. Does anyone even know what this is? I think some of the older people know. Tamagotchi, I think it might be making a comeback, actually. It's this thing, I think it was made in Japan. It's like this little simple digital device where it's like you can like keep your own digital pet, and you have to feed it periodically, and if you don't, it dies. So it's like that, except this is desires like this kind of like terrifying nightmares Tamagotchi, where your pet is never satisfied. You keep feeding it and it just gets bigger and bigger. And then it takes up your entire house, and it takes over your life, and it destroys your life ultimately. So there's no contentment, no happiness ultimately in fulfilling your desires. That's the basic idea. Another verse that I really love, which conveys the same point in a very direct and simple way, is from the Vairagya Shatakam, which is this work written by a renunciate called 100 Verses on Renunciation. And the verse is, Satu bhavati daridro yasya trishna vishala manasi cha paritushte kortavan ko daridra. That person is poor. So he's giving beautiful definitions of poverty and wealth, respectively, in contrast to common sense definitions. Common sense definition, poor means I don't have much money. Wealth means I've got lots of money and material possessions. No. Satu bhavati daridro, daridra means poor. Yasya trishna vishala. That person is poor whose desires are great. What a beautiful definition of poverty. That person is poor, truly poor, in a deeper sense, whose desires are great. Manasi cha paritushte kortavan ko daridraha. When the mind is contented, who is poor and who is rich? So true wealth is not about having a lot of material possessions and a lot of money, but about having inner contentment. So to give you a simple example, imagine one person who's a multimillionaire. Let's say he has $5 million. He looks at his neighbor. We went at Montpanel, we saw these amazing multi-million-dollar houses on the banks of this the lake or the river. It's a lake, right? Lake. Yeah, man-made lake. And just imagine, I'm the owner of one of these. I'm a multimillionaire. I own one of these houses, and I'm sitting on my yacht, enjoying myself. And then I turn and I see my neighbor's got a bigger yacht than I do, and that yacht costs $300 million. I don't have that kind of money. What does that do to me? I've got to have that yacht. I've got to have an even bigger yacht than my neighbor's yacht. I've got to show him up. And then I spent another 10 years trying to, working my way up, climbing up the corporate ladder to get that amount of money. And then I get that yacht. And then I see somebody else who's got, whatever, like a private jet. There's no end. That person is poor, whose desires are great. And the person who has maybe, a modest $60,000 salary, modest for the US, let's say, but is contented, doesn't have extravagant desires, is happy with what he or she has. That person is wealthier than the multimillionaire who's envious of his neighbor's yacht. So logically, so there's a real logic behind it. It's not like the grandfather saying, don't do this, don't do that. That's not the purpose behind renouncing desire. The idea is that it's for our own good. And every single one of us eventually will realize that. but it takes some people longer than others. And Schopenhauer, one of the great German philosophers, he used to say, he was influenced by Vedanta. And so he had great respect and reverence for religious saints in different traditions, Hindu saints, Christian saints. He would quote their teachings. And he would say that you have to renounce desire in order to attain fulfillment, he would say, to overcome the will in his technical language. Willing means desiring, basically. And then he says, but look, for most of us, it's too difficult, this path of renunciation. And he says, but there's a path that's meant for everybody. It's a very beautiful moment in his great philosophical masterpiece called The World as Will and Representation, where he says, what is that path that's accessible to everybody? It's the path of suffering. The path of suffering. If you don't learn the easy way through renunciation, you learn the hard way through suffering. Swami Vivekananda said the same thing. I'll tell you two statements of his, which I find very useful. I'm a Hindu chaplain at two universities, at University of Southern California and at UCLA. And these are my go-to statements, quotable quotes from Swami Vivekananda. One of them, what is the secret of life? Swami Vivekananda says, the secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. The secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. So when I explain Vedanta, I don't teach it as a kind of preachy religion or philosophy, spiritual philosophy. It's not do this or don't do that. Go ahead and do what you think is right. But know that you're going to reap what you sow. This is Vedanta. Go ahead. If you want to do that, then do it. But do it mindfully. Whatever you do, do it mindfully. This is what mindfulness means, actually. Do it with your eyes open. If you think that getting X, Y, or Z is going to make you happy, try to get X, Y, and Z, but try to do it mindfully and try to learn from that experience. And then when you get X and you don't feel satisfied, try to learn from that experience as well. And so the second go-to statement of mine, which is a little bit more sort of depressing, but true. Swami Vivekananda says, suffering is the great eye-opener. I think each one of us has learned more from our suffering and our failures than from our successes. This is another fact of life. We can learn from joy and from happiness as well, but we often learn more from suffering. I've seen many cases of this in my own life and in other people's lives. So it's the same thing. If you want to fulfill your desires, go ahead and try. But if you're a spiritual aspirant, whatever you do, try to do it mindfully. And if you're a bhakta, if you're a devotee of the personal God, then as you engage in these things, offer what you're doing to God. This also is a great help. That's a kind of theistic mindfulness, you can call it, devotional mindfulness. I'll give you one more, maybe a couple more, but one more Sanskrit quotation. This comes from the Mahabharata. It's about desire as well. It's about the need to renounce desires. Yatcha kama sukham loke, yatcha divyam mahat sukham, trishna kshaya sukhasyete narhata shodashim kalam. It's from the Shanti Parvan. Bhagavad Gita is part of the Mahabharata. Everybody knows that. There's another very profound philosophical portion of the Mahabharata called the Shanti Parvan. Shanti means peace, transcendental spiritual peace. And it's full of the highest wisdom. So this is taken from the Shanti Parvan. So the translation would be, if you calculate all of the happiness one can get from sense objects in this world, add to that all of the higher forms of happiness that you get in the higher realms, like all the little heavens, the heavens that you can go to, temporary heavens. All this happiness is not even 1/16, Shodashim Kalam, of the happiness, of the joy derived from eliminating one's desires. Trishna Kshaya Sukham. It's a qualitatively different kind of happiness. The joy so if you have 5 desires and you keep fulfilling those desires, what happens? Each one of those desires is going to multiply and intensify. If instead of doing that, imagine that if I'm addicted to cigarettes, among my many other desires, that's one of mine, desire for cigarettes. And instead of satisfying my craving by smoking a cigarette, I decide to quit. In the beginning, it's very, very painful. It's terrible. I might have physical withdrawal symptoms. Mentally, I feel like a wreck. But after a few days, what happens? The body adjusts, the mind adjusts. And then it's like, wait a minute, I don't feel that craving for cigarettes anymore. The fifth desire is gone. That means I only have 4 desires. And you're that much happier. You'll see that in the life of every spiritual aspirant, is that when every desire that you eliminate from your life, the happier you become. You can actually track it. And this is linked to something that Bhagavan Krishna says in chapter 18 of Bhagavad Gita. One of the beautiful things about Bhagavad Gita, which I think it shares in common with the gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, the Kathamrita. These are texts with the highest spiritual and philosophical teachings. But at the same time, they're intensely practical texts. Both of them. The gospel on every page is very practical. The Gita on every page is also very practical. So at the end of, if you know how to chant the Gita traditionally in Sanskrit, at the end of every chapter, there's a colophon, which means there's something that you traditionally recite. You give the name of the chapter. There's a traditional name given to each chapter. And then that colophon refers to the Bhagavad Gita as Brahma Vidyayam Yoga Shastre. It teaches the highest Brahma Vidya, knowledge of Brahman, the knowledge of the ultimate truth. And it's also a Yoga Shastra. It's a practical spiritual manual. So in that context, I want to quote to you chapter 18. Bhagavan Krishna is distinguishing different kinds of happiness. And Krishna says, there's sattvika happiness, rajasika happiness, and tamasika happiness. So let me begin with rajasika happiness, because that's the desire, that's the focus of our talk today. Vishayendriya sanyogad yattadagre mirtopamam pariname vishamiva tatsukham rajasam sukham. It's a beautiful metaphor. Anytime you engage in sense enjoyment, and the stronger the desire, the more true that this logic takes effect, the more intensely it takes effect. Anytime you engage in any kind of sense enjoyment, what happens? It feels like nectar in the beginning. And in the end, it feels like poison. And the stronger the sense desire that you fulfill, the more you feel that poison in the end. Okay? And then sattvika happiness is exactly the opposite. Well, before I get to the sattvika happiness, let me read you. Sri Aurobindo, he was a great writer. Of course, he's very difficult to read for some people, especially if English is not your mother tongue. It's very, very challenging. But let me read you his kind of gloss on Rajasika happiness in the Bhagavad Gita. He has a book called Essays on the Gita. He says, this joy, meaning this Rajasika happiness, is nectar to the lips at first touch. But there is a secret poison in the bottom of the cup. Secret poison, because we're not aware of it until it's too late. And after it, the bitterness of disappointment, satiety, fatigue, revolt, disgust, sin, suffering, loss, transience. Facts of life. Sattvika happiness. Bhagavan Krishna says, Yattad agre vishamiva pariname mritopamam tat sukham sattvikam proktam atma buddhi prasadajam. That joy, which feels like poison at first and becomes like nectar in the future afterward, that is sattvika happiness, which is atma buddhi prasadajam. It's a very expressive phrase in Sanskrit, and it can be interpreted in different ways, and different traditional commentators have interpreted in different ways. Again, I like Sri Aurobindo's translation here. Let me read to you Sri Aurobindo's explanation of it. He says, this sattvika happiness does not depend on outward things. We don't need anything external to us to make us happy, but on ourselves alone and on the flowering of what is best and most inward within us. But it is not at first our normal possession. It has to be conquered by self-discipline, a labor of the soul, a high and arduous endeavor. At first, this means much loss of habitual pleasure. It might feel very, very painful at first. Much suffering and struggle. A poison born of the churning of our nature. Because we actually have to engage in self-transformation. We have to train ourselves to like things and desire things that we haven't liked for our entire lives. That's the difficulty and challenge of spiritual life, actually. A painful conflict of forces, much revolt and opposition to the change due to the ill will of the members or the insistence of vital movements. But in the end, the nectar of immortality rises in the place of this bitterness. And as we climb to the higher spiritual nature, we come to the end of sorrow, the euthanasia of grief and pain. That is the surpassing happiness which descends upon us at the point or line of culmination of the Sattvika discipline. In the end, it becomes like nectar. Just to give you concrete examples, many of you are initiated in our tradition, which means you're given a mantra. To do japa, mental repetition of a mantra. When we first do it, actually the first, let's say, few days, usually people are very excited about it and, oh, I'm having all sorts of experiences. They run to their guru and say, I'm having this vision and that. Usually they're not true. They're just like emotional experiences. Sometimes they're true. I don't want to say they're all false. But after that honeymoon period, let's call it that initial honeymoon period, after you're first given the mantra and you feel like you're on spiritual cloud 9, then you come down to earth. And what happens? It becomes drudgery for a lot of people. And I have to sit again every morning, falling asleep while you're doing your japa, and it feels mechanical. It's not coming. There's no feeling behind it. In fact, there's a very interesting incident in the gospel when many of you, if you know about the great personages in the life of Sri Ramakrishna and different characters in his great divine drama, one of them was Balaram Bosch, one of the great devotees in a Vaishnava family. His father visits Sri Ramakrishna one day, and he's an Orthodox Vaishnava. He's got everything. And Orthodox Vaishnavas, typically they have this, what's called a tholi in Bengali, which means it's a bag to keep your rosary beads in. And literally constantly you're doing it. You go to Vrindavan, you'll see a lot of people just walking around talking. As they're talking, they're still doing this constantly. So he's doing it. Sri Ramakrishna's talking, giving his discourses. And Sri Ramakrishna, he was a very gentle soul, but sometimes he would say these things that would really just cut right to the quick. And he notices Balaram's father, very aged, very pious person, genuine spiritual aspirant, doing his japa quietly in the corner of the room. And he says, why is it that people like him, who spent almost 24 hours doing japa, why are they not making much spiritual progress? Sing in front of him and his son and in a room full of people. He says, because there's no bakulata in Bangla. There's no feeling behind that japa. You should do the japa as if you're calling on God directly. And it's easier said than done. Again, that's why in the beginning it's like poison. It's mechanical, it's boring, it's drudgery. In the end, that nectar comes when you start feeling this, what's called raga bhakti. Sri Ramakrishna would say there's a difference between Vaidhi Bhakti and Raga Bhakti. Vaidhi Bhakti means you're going through the motions. You're doing everything as you should, as a proper spiritual aspirant should. You're sitting down every morning and evening, and you're avoiding these unethical things and all that. But it all somehow doesn't feel like you're not getting a joy from it. Raga Bhakti, he says, is when this joy bubbles up from within, and you feel spontaneously this love for God. It's not love exactly, it's an intense longing. Love is the goal, but an intense longing, an intense feeling for God. So that when you take the name of God, it's like a 5-year-old calling on his mother, who's the most important thing in the world for him. That's the way that we should be doing our japa. Anyway, that's a kind of a bit of a detour. But coming back to this phrase, Atma Buddhi Prasadajam, Sattvika happiness, Sattvika joy is a happiness that is born, jam means born, from prasada, from the satisfaction of Atma and Buddhi. And here different translators or different commentators have different interpretations. Sri Aurobindo, again, I think really hits it on the spot. He says, Sattvika happiness is happiness that is born of the satisfaction of the higher mind and spirit. Buddhi here is higher mind. What's the lower mind? The sense-oriented mind, the mind that chases after sense pleasures. What Sri Ramakrishna used to call the rascal ami, bodjat ami, as opposed to the bhaktir ami, the devotee's eye. This is the eye that's attached to worldly desires, worldly attachments. Higher buddhi is the buddhi that wants you to be more sattvic, that wants you to engage in sattvika activities, that wants you to be devoted to God, that wants you to renounce. That's the higher mind. And spirit, even more fundamentally, each one of us is a divine soul. Each soul is potentially divine. Is one of the most important statements that Swami Vivekananda made in the West. And it was startling to Christians who had never heard this. They knew about original sin, and he's telling us each one of you is divine. So ultimately, Sattvika joy helps us go deeper within and realize our true divine nature. That's the beauty of it. And the more we indulge in worldly desires and worldly attachment, what happens? We identify more and more with the superficial body-mind complex, which makes us miserable. So the more we go within, the more we're able to erode our identification with the body-mind complex and identify with our deeper spiritual nature, our eternal, blissful, divine spiritual nature, the more happy and joyful our spiritual lives will be. And, as I promised, I said with the Sandesh point. So let me conclude with the Sandesh point. But there's a broader issue in this context, which is this. You might say, well, Maharaj, not all desires are alike. There are big desires and there are small desires, innocent desires. Aren't there innocent desires? It's true in a way. Sri Ramakrishna, again, there's an incident in his life when he suddenly had this desire to wear a very expensive shawl. And so Motur Babu would get him anything he wanted. So Motur Babu was very wealthy. And so he got him this beautiful, very expensive shawl. He wore it for a couple seconds, said, oh, my mind, this is so-and-so beautiful. I don't know what kind of shawl it was. Enjoy it. And then the next moment, he felt such an intense spirit of dispassion, he threw it on the ground and started trampling on it. And Motur Babu, no, it's a very expensive shawl. Don't do that. So he recovered the shawl. So he did that with a couple items. You can call these sort of things innocent desires. Why is it innocent in what sense? Innocent because it's not like heroin, like you do it once and then you're going to have this overwhelming desire to do it again. It depends on the person. Ultimately, at the end of the day, each person is different. And you have to decide for yourself, what are your biggest desires and what are your innocent desires? Some people are tremendously attached to food. This is just a fact. Some people, they live to eat rather than eat to live. And for these people, the desire for food is a big desire. For another person, that person, you'll see that they'll eat quickly. After the meal, they forget about it. They don't think about the next meal until the next meal comes. That's another person. That's another kind of paradigm. For that person, that's a small desire. The desire for food is a small desire. But they may have some other huge desire, which that other person may not have, who's a glutton, you can say. So you have to decide for yourself what is a big desire and what's a small desire. But with regard to the food point, that's why I'm bringing up the Sandesh issue. Why did Holy Mother say Sandesh? Even if you have a desire for a single sweetmeat, as they say, you will not attain liberation. This is a very controversial point, especially in the Ramakrishna Vivekananda Holy Mother tradition. Why? Because we're famous for not being particularly strict about food. Every devotee will know this. They're the ones who cook for us, monks, so we know that. So, Sri Ramakrishna never emphasized the need to renounce food and all that. That's not quite true. It's complicated. It's actually more complex. And I wanted to just flag some of that complexity. On the one hand, there's an incident recorded in the gospel when Swami Vivekananda's friend Bhavanath, they're both there. And Swamiji, who is then Naran, tells Sri Ramakrishna with a smile, he says, Bhavanath has just renounced fish and pan, betel leaf. And Sri Ramakrishna says, he turns to Bhavanath and he says, why did you renounce fish and betel leaf? That's not true. That's not the most fundamental renunciation. The true renunciation is the renunciation of kamini kancha, lust and greed. That's the true renunciation. So that's one side of our tradition, and it's absolutely fundamental. It's really true. That's very true. At the same time, and many people will selectively quote this incident or something like that, or Holy Mother used to say, Mach khile mata thanda thake. If you eat fish, your head will stay cool, your brain will stay cool. So we'll quote that. But there are many other incidents which complicate the whole matter. So, for instance, I think it was Niranjan Maharaj, who was later Niranjananandaji. He loved eating. And so at night, when he would visit Sri Ramakrishna, he would eat a bunch of chapatis, like a bunch, either chapati or luchi. I don't remember which kind it was. And Holy Mother would happily give him it. And Sri Ramakrishna scolded him. You shouldn't be eating that much. And Holy Mother, he didn't call Holy Mother. He said, why are you giving him so many? She said, I'll take care of it. That's my domain. Cooking is my domain. But the thing is that Sri Ramakrishna himself, he also recognized the importance. It depends on the individual. You have to be honest with yourself and ask yourself, how attached am I to X, Y, or Z? And if it's food, you have to ask yourself, how attached am I? And giving excuses and justifying yourself and justifying everything in the name of saying that the only thing that matters is lust and renouncing lust and greed is you're cheating yourself in the end. So it depends on the individual. And I'm just giving the example of food, but it depends on, you can, use whatever, take your pick, whatever it is. If it's love of traveling, that itself could become a bondage. Love of your kids. Are you overly attached to your kids? There's a thing called helicopter parenting. You become obsessed with your kids. That's often it creates a rift between parents because one parent might be much more laid back as a parent. The other one's the opposite. That ends in divorce sometimes. So in any case, you have to figure out for yourself, what are your deepest attachments? And then as a spiritual aspirant, you need to try to overcome those attachments. That's the idea. Okay. So now I'd love to hear from you. Let us pray to Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, and Swami Vivekananda, that we can, by the grace of the Holy Trio, reduce our wants, reduce our needs, gradually try to eliminate the worldly desires from our life and realize God in this very life. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Questions?
Any questions? What about the creative desire or the Icha Shakti of, let's say, Shiva?
Yeah.
How do you connect to those?
Yeah, creative desire. Yeah. So some people will justify indulging lust in that way by saying, well, that's natural. The desire for procreation is something that we have biologically. And so therefore we should not. And this was said to Swamiji when he was in the West. I think a doctor had said this. Said that it's natural. It's part of nature. It's part of who we are. And Swamiji said in response, all spiritual progress and all ethical progress comes from fighting nature, not by going along with nature. Animals regularly rape and murder. Does that mean we should? That's what they do, right? In the wild. So that's called the naturalistic fallacy. Just because something is natural doesn't mean that it's right to do it. So that's one thing. But your question actually is, you're using a kind of technical term from Kashmiri Shaivism and Tantra philosophy, which is that the divine reality itself has this kind of desire to manifest. There's a kind of creative impulse at the heart of the divine. That's what Sri Ramakrishna calls Shakti. Sri Ramakrishna would say, when I think of ultimate reality as Brahman, when I think of the ultimate reality as Nishkriya, which means inactive, static, then I call it Brahman. When I think of that same reality as creating, preserving, and destroying the universe, then I call it Shakti or Kali. So that's that same reality in one aspect is Nirguna, which means attributeless, impersonal. It's our true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. It's what Savarpananji lectures about most of the time. And on the other hand, that same reality is Shakti. It's dynamic. That very Brahman has become the 24 cosmic principles, is something that comes up again and again in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna would say the Vijnani realizes that Brahman itself has become the 24 cosmic principles, has become everything in this world as Shakti. Because Brahman has in it that creative impulse. And of course, that's a wonderful thing. If we can identify with Shakti, then all our problems will go away. But lust is a kind of degradation of that divine creative impulse. Because it's ultimately rooted in ego and selfishness. At the end of the day, there's another interesting incident. Swamiji is walking with some of his Western female disciples, somewhere in the US, I think, walking through the woods. And there's a kind of a tricky area with a bit of a brook with rocks and some water. And Swamiji goes first and waits for them on the other side. And these young American women who are used to chivalry, say, well, that's not very chivalrous of you. Aren't you going to hold out your hand? And he gives them a scolding of their lifetime. He said, don't you see that behind chivalry is nothing but naked lust? This is a startling statement, but it's true. Lust is always grounded in selfishness in the end. One of the most common words in every human language is love, and almost nobody in the world can really love. And what most people call love is nothing but lust. There's selfishness and selfish attachment behind it. It's what Swami Vivekananda called sanctified shopkeeping. That's not love. The moment you expect anything in return, that's not love. If you love your kid expecting something in return from him, you don't love your kid. If you love your spouse or your romantic partner expecting something from them, you don't love them. But people are so glib about love. I've never understood what love means. And people think it's the most obvious thing in the world. Anyway, that was a long answer. But I hope I answered it. Yeah. Tell me your name before you ask your question.
Hello. My name is Sarv. I just moved to Austin 2 weeks ago.
Oh, welcome.
So I'm new like you.
Great.
And my question is, when you understand that there's some sort of compulsive behavior or some attachment to the body or mind that you seem to be fixated on, how do you keep the necessary attention to continue observing it even though it's painful?
Observing, you mean the renunciation, like avoiding that, whatever that indulgence is or temptation?
Correct.
There's no one answer to that question. Again, it has to do with knowing who you are and what works for you. And so I'll give you a couple different strategies depending on your temperament, and one of them might click with you. One of them is there have been a lot of actual scientific studies on this, on mindfulness and how effective it is in treating alcoholism, for instance. And one of the techniques, I recommend a book, for instance, on mindfulness called Satipatthana, The Direct Path to Realization by Analayo. Bhikkhu Analayo is, I think, a German monk, very scholarly monk who did his PhD in philosophy in Germany. He's written a great book on Buddhist mindfulness, and he quotes some of these scientific studies. So one of them, in one of these studies, they're in a rehab clinic for alcoholics. And what they tell the recovering alcoholic, the one who's forced to be sober, is this. The person will just, the scientist, the doctor will just tell that person, whenever a desire for alcohol arises in your mind, label it. The practice is called the practice of mental labeling. Just label the thought. It sounds very simple and like, what the heck, what's that going to do? Just by labeling the desire as it emerges, as it arises in the mind, has helped many people overcome alcoholism. Because what it does is it helps you take a step back from that desire. You're no longer identified with that desire. You prize apart the desire from who you are. The moment you label it, it means that that's not you. And it loses its power over you. It loses its grip over you. So long as you identify with the desire, you become its slave. Okay, so this is one technique which doesn't require any belief in God. And it's very simple in a way. Of course, the practice can be difficult, but you can get off the ground pretty easily with it. There's a bhakti-oriented strategy for people who believe in God. Prayer is incredibly effective. I gave a lecture recently in Santa Barbara called Pray Without Ceasing about this. So you can look at that lecture if you're interested. And the idea in the bhakti path is, it's hubristic, it's egoistic ultimately to think that you can make substantial spiritual progress on your own, through your own self-effort, purushakara. No real spiritual progress is made without depending on God. So surrender to God, and you're going to find that God will take care of everything. Sri Ramakrishna would say there are two different paradigms of spiritual aspirant. One is the baby monkey with his baby mother. What's that paradigm? That's the paradigm of self-effort. The baby monkey is holding on for dear life to his mother's hand as the mother hops from tree to tree. What happens if the baby lets go its hold? It'll be dashed to the ground and killed. Self-effort. The bhakti paradigm, the surrender paradigm, is the paradigm of the baby kitten who just says mew mew. The equivalent of meow meow is mew mew in Bengali. And it calls on its mother. The mother will come and take it into its mouth. And the baby is not bothered at all. I'm happy wherever the mother places me, whatever the mother wants to do with me. completely surrendered to mother's will. That's the paradigm of surrender. That's the bhakti paradigm. So this mindfulness stuff is more self-effort oriented. And it's not that one is better than the other, but it depends on your temperament. And if you're not the type to really have faith in God and all that, then it's bhakti is not going to work for you. Maybe what happens is people evolve. That's another thing, is that almost no sincere spiritual aspirant is static. It might be that in the beginning of their spiritual life, they have absolutely no interest in God. And then after 10 years, they start having a very deep faith in God. That happens. In our tradition, there's a funny thing that happens. Many senior monks say this, that many monks join the order being inspired by, can you guess, among the three, who's the main inspiration in the Holy Trio? Swami Vivekananda. After a number of years of spiritual practice and monastic life, their affection and love and the Ishtadevata starts moving toward, guess, who's number two? Or like later in the middle phase, Sri Ramakrishna. And at the very end, when they become very old, mother, Holy Mother. This is common. I'm not saying it's true of everybody, but so every spiritual aspirant also evolves. And it could be that you find in one point in your spiritual life, mindfulness, mental labeling, this kind of practice of taking a step back from what arises in your mind is a very helpful practice. Later on, you might find that surrender to God is the best practice for you. You might find that some combination of these two or some third practice or fourth practice is also helpful. So there's no one universal, one size fits all kind of answer. You have to kind of analyze yourself and then see what works. And that's the adventure and fun of spiritual life. Spiritual life is fun too, because you try out different things. And you're going to have your failures, but at the end of the day, you can be reassured, in our tradition at least, and it's not true of every Hindu tradition, unfortunately. Every single soul will eventually attain God realization. If not in this life, then in a future life. Sri Ramakrishna used to say that everybody will eventually be fed. Some people at 6 a.m, other people at 12 noon, other people at 6 p.m., other people at midnight. Each of those times corresponds to different lifetimes, whether it's some people will get God realization in this life, other people in 5 lives. Hitler might be 1,000,000 lives, but even Hitler's going to get God realization. He's not going to be Hitler when he gets God realization, right? He was Hitler in this life. You see, so it's a long spiritual journey, and we should be encouraged by that and not feel discouraged. Yeah. What's your name?
Hi, my name is Zakul. My question is around desires. So desires sometimes give a purpose or a focus in the direction. Like say, if I see my neighbor's yard, that's very big. For the 10 years, I'm just going to focus on getting that and be very productive or probably try to climb that ladder. Which will help my mind not to wave in multiple different directions and be very focused. So how would you, like if you cut that out, then how do you keep your mind peaceful and where do you focus it? And things like that.
That's a very good practical question. See, the thing is, I didn't really get into this, but I'll talk about this either in Houston or I think it's Houston, about the 3 gunas. So in spiritual life, ultimately you want to become sattvic. But if you're highly tamasic, you can't jump straight to sattva. Okay, so let me explain these terms a little bit. A highly tamasic person is somebody who is lazy, a procrastinator, somebody who sleeps a lot, who really, one of his or her great joys in life is sleeping. And doesn't really feel initiative to do anything. For that person, the best antidote is becoming rajasic and doing the kinds of things that you're talking about. Have some ambition in life. Swami Vivekananda told Indians who were steeped in tamas, and kind of frankly still are, many of them. He said, instead of reading the Bhagavad Gita, play football outside. Why is it that in a country of over 1 billion people, we can't produce a single gold medalist in the Olympics? It's pathetic. And South Korea has hundreds of, it should be a source of pain and embarrassment to every Indian. This is what Swamiji meant. You cannot skip steps in spiritual life. And so, yes, you should first, actually, Swami Swahananji, who is the great inspiration behind this Austin Center, he used to say, he said, you have to first develop a strong ego before you can transcend ego. People with weak egos can do nothing. Ihaloka and Paraloka, they get neither bhoga nor yoga. They can't enjoy this world. They don't achieve anything in life, in this worldly life from a worldly standpoint, and let alone spiritual progress. First, develop a strong ego. That doesn't mean becoming egoistic, but it means have self-confidence. have self-esteem, achieve something in life. Swamiji used to say, a beggar has nothing to renounce. Buddha had something to renounce. He had everything and he renounced. But the beggar who has nothing, is it impressive to renounce if you don't have anything to renounce? You're going to renounce the box that you live in? So I mean, it's a kind of indirect answer to the question, but the idea is there's a place for everything in spiritual life, and there's a point in our life when the best thing we can do for ourselves is develop self-confidence, self-esteem, a certain kind of strong ego. All the while knowing that that's not the be-all and end-all, but that we need that step first. Have your head held high, achieve something in life. And if you're a spiritual aspirant, whatever you do, whatever your achievements are, offer them to God. And then slowly you're going to find that even those ambitions are going to lessen. You're going to become less rajasic and more sattvic. And when you're sattvic, you're going to find, I don't need to, 20 years ago, I wanted to do this and that and be this and achieve that. I've done it. I proved to myself that I can. I don't want it anymore. That's the logic behind the traditional Hindu system of the 4 ashrama stages in life. Brahmacharya, which means you live as a celibate student. Second is the householder phase. But every Hindu is told, every single Hindu, if you're a true Hindu, don't think that marriage is the be-all and end-all. After that, there are 2 other stages in life for any sincere Hindu. Vanaprastha, which means you go off and dwell in a forest, either with your spouse or without your spouse, depending on whether your spouse is on board with you spiritually. But no more, worldly relationships, and instead you eat the fruit that falls from trees and you engage in spiritual practices and austerities. And ultimately, everybody should aspire to sannyasa. Every single Hindu. This is a traditional thing and it doesn't often work, but we should respect the ideal behind it, the thought behind it. And Sri Ramakrishna would tell householders, after having 1 or 2 children, try to live with your spouse like brother and sister. It's the exact opposite of what I would call Viagra culture in the West. How do I maximize my marital enjoyment up until I'm 96? It's so sad. It's just frankly sad. If you're a spiritual aspirant, the marriage should evolve. And your relationship with your spouse, your relationship with your family, with your children, with your loved ones, all of those things should undergo evolution. They should be transformed eventually. Ultimately, you have to take the carnality out of that marriage. It may not be pleasant to hear, it may not be easy to do, but if you're a true Hindu, you'll try to do it to the best of your ability.
Hi, I'm Akanksha. So my name in Hindi means desire.
I was about to say, it's an appropriate, yeah.
So it's very interesting to hear your thoughts and aspects on desire and desirelessness. And my question to you is that we have all been given life to achieve some kind of purpose and find our purpose. And to achieve that purpose, we will have desires. And you talked about desirelessness. So these 2 are very contradicting thoughts. So my question is, if we strive to become, to have no desires, then how do we achieve the purpose of our life? And if we have desires and if we are striving to achieve the purpose of our life, there's no limit to how high we can go, because sky is the limit. And like, at what point we figure out that, okay, I have achieved enough and now I want to have no desires and go to that spiritual path?
Yeah, this is sort of similar to the question of the person sitting next to you. I forgot your name.
Akanksha.
No, the one. Lakan.
Vakul.
Yeah, B-A-K-U. Similar. So see, again, I mean, Vedanta, the thing is, they don't give one-size-fits-all answers to people. Because each one of us, even though we look alike, similar and all that, we're all followers of the same tradition, we are at vastly different stages on the same spiritual journey. Every single one of us is moving toward God realization, but one of us is very far behind. Some of us are in the middle. Some people are more advanced. And so there's no one-size-fits-all question answer to that question. And so for one person, what will be most beneficial to them spiritually is to just achieve something. That's why I said, That's why Swamiji said, play football before you read the Bhagavad Gita. Because for that person is highly tamasic. That person needs to be rajasic before he can be sattvic. For that person, fulfilling certain worldly ambitions is the best thing you can do. Prove to yourself that you can achieve something in this life. Another thing is, after you achieve something, you're going to ask, well, how much is enough and all that? You see, if you're a spiritual aspirant, you just, you know, there's a point you reach when you're like, I figured it out. You know, I did it before when I did my PhD and I was getting a certain praise and this and that. I was publishing things, certain recognition. And I certain academic achievements, I was like, you know what, this is enough. Ironically, I'm still an academic, but I do, hopefully on a different footing, on a more spiritual footing. But in any case, it comes. And the people to whom it doesn't come, they're the people who are the most miserable. Because ambition is never ultimately satisfied. You always want something more. But that's the lesson that we have to, that's the hard lesson that we have to learn. That's why Swamiji said that the secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. At some point, we will have to be educated through our experience. And it's through engaging in pursuing our ambitions that we learn. I mean, that's, I don't, does that answer the question or? Okay, thank you. Anyone else? I think you had a question, yeah. Oh, there are many questions, that's good. We've got a lively audience. Please tell me your name first.
My name is Partha.
Partha.
Yeah. You mentioned, even though it is not directly related to the topic that we have talked today, desirelessness. You did mention about Japan, the people who take initiation from the monks. So what is the difference? The japa will take us ultimately to meditation, the real meditation, because Thakur used to say that mainly on the meditation, that is, you look at try to see some light in the center of your eyebrows, but as far as Holy Mother is concerned, Holy Mother always used to give a lot of importance on japa, the number of japas. Of course, what you said that the japa, instead of making it mechanical, if you can make it with a lot of
some feeling behind it,
then it will be much more
effective.
So from your own experience, if I may assume that you also started with japa and then finally you transferred from japa to meditation.
No. Why should you think that? No. The thing is, I see one thing that I find, especially in this age, post-pandemic age of spirit, like YouTube spirituality made easy. Everybody thinks that saying, I am Brahman, I am that Brahman, that's enough. And what happens is when you start developing that attitude, you start poo-pooing these practices like japa. This is a wonderful practice that can take us all the way to God realization. Japa itself can take us all the way to our spiritual goal. And the problem is, especially when people teach, spiritual gurus teach Advaita Vedanta, classical Advaita Vedanta, is the problem is they put bhakti on a lower footing. And all the practices in bhakti, prayer, japa, all lower practices. For whom? For spiritual idiots. Those who don't have pure minds, those who aren't sophisticated enough to understand Advaita. And who wants to be an idiot? Nobody wants to be. There are a lot of idiots, but nobody wants to be an idiot. Nobody wants to think that they're an idiot. So spiritual idiocy, so everybody wants to think that they're eligible for the higher practices, but almost nobody is. That's one thing, is you have to be brutally honest about where you really stand. And secondly, Holy Mother is the shining example of somebody she is Divine Mother herself. And she would do ek lok ko jap. She said she would do japa like you see the second hand on a clock. Tuk, 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 tuk. That's called ajapa japa. That's japa that's done, it bubbles up from within spontaneously. You don't have to actually consciously repeat the mantra because it's like a clock. So if Holy Mother can do japa, who is God herself, Jagat Janani, and obviously is beyond God realization, who are we to say that it's going to be transcended ultimately by meditation? And saying that Sri Ramakrishna didn't emphasize it, I think, is misleading, because in gospel you'll find that he says in several places, he gives the example of a giant log floating in a let's say a river, and there's a huge chain, metal chain, that you're holding on the bank. You're standing on the bank. You want to get to that log, but it's very far away. What do? Link by link of that chain, you start pulling. Ultimately, what's going to happen? You're going to end up with that log. It says, just like that, repeating God's name is like pulling that chain. The log is God. Doing japa itself is a self-sufficient spiritual practice. Never think that because the moment that you as a spiritual aspirant think that I'm doing a lower practice, which ultimately is going to be transcended, that's the low self-esteem I was talking about. Feeling like you're something inferior and I'm lower, and oh, look at that other person. He's in Jnana Mudra and he doesn't need the mantra. He's just looking at light in his eyebrow, between his eyebrows. Sri Ramakrishna only talked about light between eyebrows in a very specific context, as far as I'm aware. In the gospel, he distinguishes, he says that Shiva yoga from Vishnu yoga. And he says that the Shiva yogi is the one who sees light between his eyebrows and dances in joy, seeing that his divine nature is something spiritual. And Vishnu yoga is meditating on God in the heart. And Virajanandaji, one of our great monks, stalwarts, president of our order, he was doing so much meditation between the eyebrows that he started having tremendous headaches. And he was almost becoming mentally unbalanced, and he contacted Holy Mother. And Holy Mother said, stop meditating between the eyebrows. And he was a very evolved spiritual aspirant. And she said, meditate on God in the heart. So that's a long answer. The short answer is, don't look down on japa. Japa itself can take you to the highest goal of God realization. Try to infuse the japa with feeling. And one way of doing that is when you repeat the mantra mentally, repeat it in the second person, as if you're directly addressing your Ishta Devata. Like you're calling, like if I call on my mother, I'm saying, oh Ma, please come. Repeat the mantra like you're calling on Sri Ramakrishna or whoever your Ishta Devata is. What that does is automatically then you develop that feeling. That's one practical tip. Second practical tip is bhajans, spiritual music, religious music is an extremely powerful way of bringing feeling into your devotional practices. And so before you sit for japa, maybe you listen to, I think there's some background static or something. The mic? So before you engage in your japa, whatever your daily practice is, listen to a nice bhajan, one of your favorite bhajans. It'll immediately bring your mind to a higher state. And you'll get this sort of feeling of love and devotion. And then it'll make your japa more effective. We went to the Radha, what's that temple called this morning, Rajandarji? Radha Madhav. And we walked in, and there's beautiful bhajans in the background. Wonderful Radha bhajan, Krishna Radha. It's very sattvic, so it's just being repeated over and over again. And it really just, it helps tune the mind to a higher level as you're praying, as you're doing your japa. So these are some practical tips. So, sorry? That's up to you guys. Let's. How about one or two more questions? Online. Oh, I see. Okay. So how about
2 questions? 2 more.
2 more?
Okay.
Yeah. 2 more questions, and then online we can do a couple. Oh, there's only one. Good. Okay. Yeah. I'll try to be more economical in my answers. Yeah.
My name is Priyanka.
Yeah,
I'm
hi.
a PhD student at UT Austin.
Oh, good.
So my question is a follow-up of Vaku's question. In this transition of an ambition-filled, say, Rajasic life to a more sattvic, desireless life, there can be a devolution into like a tamasic nihilism or lethargy. Is that a thing? If so, how do we prevent that or overcome that? And I mainly see it as a tantrum thrown up by the ego. So because Rajasic needs a certain ego, and when you want to drop it, it throws up this fight.
And then you're saying you become more tamasic. Is that the idea?
Yeah.
That might be because you're doing it prematurely. That's why I said that it's better to, if you have a strong ambition or desire to do something, then it might be better. You might be better off fulfilling it, trying to fulfill it. And in the attempt to fulfill it, you're going to learn a lot in the process. And then that vairagya, that dispassion will come more naturally. And then that problem of tamas won't come, actually. Tamas comes, I find, there are people who kind of turn to spirituality because they didn't really achieve anything in life. It's like a kind of early retirement for them. And that is kind of tamasic. That's why I think first achieve something, then you can transcend that achievement. So first rajas, then sattva.
Last question.
Yeah.
Last question.
Okay, one last in-person question, then one online question at the very, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, anybody else here, or should we go to the online question? Okay. Oh, yeah, no? Do you have a question? Yeah, give it to, yeah. Okay, last question.
Okay.
You do the honors. What's your name?
My name is Nishant.
Nishant.
Yes.
Hi.
So this question, you did touch upon lifetimes and various phases where one might hit desirelessness or enlightenment. Is there a pattern between like householder and sannyasis?
Is there a what between them?
Is there a pattern?
Pattern? Is that
pattern?
Pattern?
Right.
Between householders and sannyasis?
It's like across lifetimes, like being a householder and then becoming a sannyasi.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. Well, I said that, right? Didn't I? That the senior monk told us, was it here or somewhere else? That he said that you guys are monks in this life because you were married in a previous life.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have to be a sannyasi at some point in your lifetime
That's
to
complicated.
attain.
It's controversial. It's controversial because Swamiji in one place seems to say yes, but I think that's too strong because there are some shining examples of householders who attain God realization, except with the caveat that they were pretty unusual householders. Look at Nag Mahashaya, for instance. Instead of sleeping in the same bed with his wife, he would sleep on the branch of a tree. So if you're that kind of householder, then no wonder you're getting God realization. But, yeah, as I said, if you're a true spiritual aspirant in your marriage as a householder, and not just in marriage, but in your family life and everything, means that you're open to evolving. That's the main thing. Don't get stuck at the stage of enjoyment and attachment. And you'll have all that. Go through it. Education through experience, as Swamiji said. But then what's going to happen is, as you learn from those experiences, as you mindfully undergo those experiences, you're going to naturally feel the need to kind of take it to the next level. That means, let me try to refine my relationship with my spouse. Let me try to take the carnality of it. Let me try to be less attached to my children and let them grow in their own way. Let me, oh man, all I wanted was a Mercedes. Now I have the Mercedes, and now it's not all that. You see, that's called maturity and growth. Yeah, thank you. So now the online question.
There's an online question.
Sorry, I'm giving a heavy dose of renunciation today. It might be, I hope it's not too much, but yeah.
This is from Aditya.
Yeah.
It says, can you please speak about letting go of desires in the context of other religions, especially Christianity and Judaism? Is letting go of desires also an aspect in those spiritual paths?
Well, certainly. I mean, I started the lecture by quoting Jesus, who said you can choose God or mammon, but not both. And Jesus also said, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And so, yes, it's definitely. Now, Judaism, the thing is, look for in Judaism, of course, their Bible is the Hebrew Bible, right? What's called the Old Testament by Christians, but better to call it the Hebrew Bible. And there's a beautiful section called the Psalms, the Book of Psalms, Psalms. There's these beautiful poems addressed to God. These remind me of the songs that you find in the gospel, which upon hearing which, Sri Ramakrishna will go into samadhi. These incredibly lofty spiritual devotional sentiments. And I love sacred classical music, Western classical music, and also Indian bhajans. But now I'm talking about sacred classical music in the West. What they've done is, what these great composers like Bach and Mozart and many others have done is they've taken psalms, statements from the Psalms, from the Hebrew Bible, and put them to music. And they're incredibly moving. And you listen to it, and if you follow the meaning, just as if you follow the meaning of a Ram Prasad song or some great bhajan, same thing. If you follow the meaning with concentration, just listening itself is a great spiritual practice. And what do these Psalms talk about? Nothing but, so they use these metaphors. Like one is, I'm panting for God, oh Lord. I'm panting for you like I'm panting for breath when I'm held underwater for a long time. See, so even the Hebrew Bible and Christ's teachings are full of the need to long for God. Jesus said the first and highest commandment is to love God with all your heart. What is that? But renouncing worldly desires for the desire of God. Because you cannot have both. Shreya or Preya, God or Mammon. Buddhism says the same thing. Choose one, but you can't have both. This attempt to mix Bhoga with yoga always ends in self-deception or disaster. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
We have a full Q&A session tomorrow. So please reserve all your questions. And we are ending at this stage. And the prasad distribution. Yes, we have prasad distribution in the next house. You can please walk behind. There's a pathway. Good lighting, no problem. So please walk behind for prasad distribution in the next house.
Thank you.
So with that, we begin this talk.